I'm just going to begin. So the title of my talk is Lenin Today. On the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Lenin's birth, I would like to approach Lenin's meaning today by critically examining an essay written by the liberal political philosopher Ralph Miliband on the occasion of Lenin's 100th birthday in 1970, which was the year of my own birth. The reason for using Miliband's essay to frame my discussion of Lenin's legacy is that the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, magazine Jacobin, republished Miliband, who is perhaps their most important theoretical inspiration, in 2018 as a belated treatment of the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution of 1917, or perhaps as a way of marking the centenary of the ill-fated German Revolution of 1918, which failed as a socialist revolution, but is usually regarded as a successful democratic revolution, issuing in the Weimar Republic under the leadership of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. There was a wound in the apparent conflict between the desiderata of socialism and democracy, in which the Russian tradition associated with Lenin is opposed to and by the German tradition associated with social democracy, or alternatively, democratic socialism, by contrast with the supposedly undemocratic socialism of Lenin, however justified or not, by Russian conditions. The German model seems to stand for conditions more appropriate to advanced capitalist and liberal democratic countries. Ralph Miliband is most famously noted for his perspective of parliamentary socialism, but this was not simply positive for Miliband, but critical, namely critical of the Labour Party of the United Kingdom. It must be noted that Miliband's sons are important leaders in the Labour Party today, among its most prominent neoliberal figures. Preceding his book on parliamentary socialism, Miliband wrote a critical essay in 1960 titled The Sickness of Labourism, written for the very first issue of the newly minted New Left Review in 1960, in the aftermath of Labour's dismal election failure in 1959. Miliband's criticism of which, of course, the DSA, Jacobin, cannot digest, let alone assimilate. The DSA, Jacobin, fall well below even a liberal such as Miliband, and not only because the US Democratic Party is something less than the UK Labour Party, either in composition or organization. Miliband's perspective thus figures for the DSA Jacobin in a specifically symptomatic way, as an indication of limits and, we must admit, ultimate failure, for instance demonstrated by the recent fate of the Bernie Sanders campaign as an attempted electoral road to socialism this year as well as back in 2016. The latter's failure leading to the explosion and growth of the DSA itself. Neither Labour's aspiration to socialism, whether back in the 1960s or more recently under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, nor the DSA's, has come to any kind of even minimal fruition. Thus the specter, the haunting memory, of Lenin presents itself for our consideration today. How does Lenin hold out the promise of socialism? Previously, I have written on several occasions on Lenin, so I am tasked to say something today that I haven't already said before. First of all, I want to address the elephant in the room, or is it the 800-pound gorilla, which is Stalinism, the apparent fate of supposed Leninism, which is also a demonstrated failure. However, it is recalled today in its own peculiar way by the penchant for neo-Stalinism that seems to be an act of defiance, épater la bourgeoisie, shock the bourgeoisie, on the part of young, or not so young, bohemian leftists, in their deeply disappointed bitterness and antipathy towards the political status quo. Leninism means a certain antinomian nihilism, against which Lenin himself was deeply opposed. An irony of history is that Lenin's legacy has succumbed to the very thing against which he defined himself, and from which his Marxism sharply departed, namely Narodnism, the romantic rage of the supposedly revolutionary intelligentsia, who claimed, understood themselves, to identify with the oppressed and exploited masses, but really for whom the latter were just a sentimental image rather than a reality. Lenin would be extremely unhappy at what he, and indeed what revolution itself, let alone socialism, has come to symbolize today. Lenin was the very opposite of a Mao or a Che or Fidel, and he was also the opposite of Stalin. How so? The three figures, Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, form the heart of the issue of the Russian Revolution and its momentous effect on the 20th century, still reverberating today. Trotsky disputed Stalin and the Soviet Union's claim to the memory of Lenin, writing in Stalinism and Bolshevism on the 20th anniversary of the Russian Revolution in 1937, that Stalinism was the antithesis of Bolshevism, a loaded word demanding specifically a dialectical approach to the problem. What did Lenin and Trotsky have in common as Marxists from which Stalin differed? Stalin's policy of socialism in one country was the fatal compromise of not only the Russian Revolution, but of Marxism, and indeed of the very movement of proletarian socialism itself. Trotsky considered Stalinism to be the opportunist adaptation of Marxism to the failure of the world socialist revolution, the limiting of the revolution to Russia. This verdict by Trotsky was not affected by the spread of communism after World War II to Eastern Europe, China, Korea, Vietnam, and later Cuba. Each was an independently, ostensibly socialist state, and by this very fact alone represented the betrayal of socialism. Their conflicts, antagonism, and competition, including wars both hot and cold, for instance, the alliance of Mao's China with the United States against Soviet Russia and the Warsaw Pact, demonstrated the lie of their supposed socialism. Of course, each side justified this by reference to the supposed capitulation to global imperialism by the other side. But the point is that all these states were part of the world capitalist status quo. It was that unshaken status quo that fatally compromised the ostensibly socialist aspirations of these national revolutions. Suffice it to say that Lenin would not have considered the outcome of the Russian Revolution, or any subsequently that have sought to follow in its footsteps, to be socialism at all. Lenin would have not considered any of them to represent the true Marxist dictatorship of the proletariat either. For Lenin, as for Marxism more generally, the dictatorship of the proletariat, never mind socialism, required the preponderant power over global capitalism worldwide, that is, victory in the core capitalist countries. This, of course, has never yet happened, so its correctness is an open question. In his 1970 Lenin centenary essay, Miliband chose to address Lenin's pamphlet on State and Revolution, an obvious choice to get at the heart of the issue of Lenin's Stalinist legacy. But Miliband shares a great deal of assumptions with Stalinism. For one, the national state framing of the question of socialism. But more importantly, Miliband, like Stalinism, elides the non-identity of the state and society, of political and social power, and hence of political and social revolution. Miliband calls this the problem of authority. In this is evoked not only the liberal democratic, but also the anarchist critique of not merely Leninism, but Marxism itself. Miliband acknowledges that indeed the problem touched on by Lenin on revolution and the state goes to the heart of Marxism, namely to the issue of the Marxist perspective on the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Marx considered his only real and essential original contribution to to socialism. In 1917, Lenin was accused of, quote, assuming the vacant throne of Bakunin in calling for all power to the Soviets, that is, to the workers' and soldiers' councils, Indeed, Miliband's choice of Lenin's writings, The State and Revolution, written in the year of the 1917 Russian Revolution, is considered Lenin's most anarchist, or at least libertarian text. Lenin's critics accused him of regressing to pre-Marxian socialism and neglecting the developed Marxist political perspective on socialist revolution as the majority action. As a majority action by the working class, reverting instead to putschism, or falling back on minority political action. This is not merely due to the minority numbers of the industrial working class in majority peasant Russia, but also and especially the minority status of Lenin's Bolshevik Communist Party, as opposed to the majority socialists of socialist revolutionaries and Menshevik social democrats, as well as of non-party socialists such as anarchist currents of various tendencies, some of whom were indeed critical of the anarchist legacy of Bakunin himself. Bakunin is infamous for his idea of the invisible dictatorship of conscious revolutionaries coordinating the otherwise spontaneous action of the masses to success, apparently repeating the early history of the revolutionary conspiracy of Blanqui in the era of the Revolution of 1848. But what was and why did Bakunin hold his perspective on the supposed invisible dictatorship? Marxism considered it the corollary, the complementary opposite of the Bonapartist capitalist state, with its paranoid Orwellian character of subordinating society through society's own complicity in the inevitable authoritarianism, the blind social compulsion of capitalism, to which everyone was subject, and in which both and neither everyone's and no one's interests are truly represented. Bakunin's invisible dictatorship was not meant to dominate, but facilitate the self-emancipation of the people themselves. So was Lenin's and Marxism's political party for socialist revolution. Lenin has, of course, been accused of the opposite tendency from anarchism, namely of being a Lassallean or state socialist. Lenin's The State and Revolution drew most heavily on Marx's critique of the Gotha program, attacking the Lassalleanism of the program of the new Social Democratic Party of Germany at its founding in 1875. So this raises the question of the specific role of the political party for Marxism. Does it lead, inevitably, to statism? The history of ostensible Leninism in Stalinism seems to demonstrate so. The antinomical contrary interpretations of Lenin, libertarian versus authoritarian, statist versus anarchist, liberal versus democratic, are not due to some inconsistency or aporia in Lenin or in Marxism itself, as Miliband for one thought, but are rather due to the contradictory nature of capitalism itself, which affects the way its political tasks appear, calling for opposed solutions. The question is Marxism's self-consciousness of this phenomenon, Lenin's awareness and consciously deliberate political pursuit of socialism under such contradictory conditions. The history of Marxism regarding rival currents in socialism, represented by Lassalle and Bakunin, must be addressed in terms of how Marxism thought it overcame the dispute between social and political action, between anarchism and statism, as a phenomenon of antinomies of capitalism, namely the need for both political and social action to overcome the contradiction of capitalist production in society. This was the necessary role of the mass political party for socialism, to link the required social and political action. Such mediation was not meant to temper or alleviate the contradiction between political and social action, between statism and anarchism, but rather to embody and in certain respects exacerbate the contradiction. Marxism was not some reconciled synthesis of anarchism and statism, a happy medium between the two, but rather actively took up, sublated, so to speak, the contradiction between them as a practical task, regarding the conflict in the socialist movement as an expression of the contradiction of capitalism, from which socialism was, of course, not free. There is not a question of abstract principles, supposedly libertarian versus authoritarian socialism, but rather the real movement of history in capitalism in which socialism is inextricably bound up. Positively, Lenin called for overcoming capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself, which also means from within the self-contradiction of socialism. Lenin stands accused of Blanchism. The 19th century socialist Louis-Auguste Blanqui gets a bad rap for his perspective of revolutionary conspiracy to overthrow the state. For Blanqui, such revolutionary political action was not itself meant to achieve socialism, but rather to clear the way for the people themselves to achieve socialism through their social action, freed from domination by the capitalist state. Miliband is at best what Marxism would have considered a petty bourgeois socialist. But really, he was a liberal, albeit under 20th century conditions of advanced late capitalism. What does this mean? It is about the attitude towards the capitalist state. The predecessor to Bakunin, Proudhon, the inventor of anarchism per se, was coldly neutral towards the revolution of 1848, but afterwards oriented positively towards the post-1848 president of the Second Republic, Louis Bonaparte, especially after his coup d'etat establishing the Second Empire. This is because Proudhon, while hostile to the state as such, still considered the Bonapartist state a potential temporary ally against the capitalist bourgeoisie. Proudhon's apparent opposite, the statist socialist Ferdinand Lassalle, had a similar positive orientation towards the eventual first chancellor of the Prussian Empire, the Kaiserreich, Bismarck, as an ally against the capitalist bourgeoisie. Bismarck, who infamously said that the results of the 1848 revolution demonstrated that not popular assemblies, but rather blood and iron, would solve the pressing political issues of the day. In this was recapitulated the old post-Renaissance alliance of the emergent bourgeoisie, the new free city-states, with the absolutist monarchy against the feudal aristocracy. The 20th century social democratic welfare state is the inheritor of such Bonapartism in the capitalist state, Bismarckism, etc. For instance, as Ephraim Karlbach has written of the late 19th century Fabian socialist enthusiasm for Bismarck, from which the UK Labour Party historically originated. The Labour Party replaced and inherited the role of the Liberal Party in the United Kingdom, which had represented the working class, especially its organization in labor unions. The Labour Party arose in the period of progressivism, progressive liberalism, and progressive liberals around the world, such as, for instance, Theodore Roosevelt in the United States, were inspired by Wilhelmine Germany that was founded by Bismarck, specifically Bismarck as the founder of the welfare state. Bismarck's welfare state provisions were made long before the socialists were any kind of real political threat. The welfare state has always been a police measure and not a compromise with the working class. Indeed, socialists historically rejected the welfare state. This hostility only changed in the 1930s with the Stalinist adoption of the People's Front Against Fascism and its positive orientation towards progressive liberal democracy. Pre-World War I, Wilhelmine Germany was considered at the time progressive and indeed liberal, part of the greater era's progressive liberal development of capitalism, which was opposed by contemporary socialists under Marxist leadership. By conflating state and society in the category of authority, further obscured by the question of democracy, Miliband expresses the liquidation of Marxism into statism. Miliband assumes the Bonapartism of the capitalist state, regarding the difference of socialism as one of mere policy. For instance, the policies pursued by the state that supposedly serve one group, say capitalists or workers, over others. This expresses a tension, indeed contradiction, between liberalism and democracy. This contradiction is often mistaken for that of liberalism versus socialism, as for instance by the post-20th century left, going back to the 1930s Stalinist era of the Communist Party's alliance with progressive liberals in support of FDR's New Deal, whose history is expressed today by DSA Jacobin. For Lenin, by contrast, the issue of politics, and hence of proletarian socialism, is not of what is being done, but rather who is doing it. The criterion of socialism for Marxism, such as Lenin's, is the activity of the working class, or lack thereof. The socialist revolution and the political regime of the dictatorship of the proletariat was not, for Lenin, the achievement of socialism, but rather its mere precondition, opening the door to the self-transformation of society beyond capitalism, led by the dictatorship or social preponderance of social power of the working class. Without this, it is inevitable that the state serves rather not the interests of the capitalists as a social group, but rather the imperatives of capital, which is different. For Lenin, the necessary dictatorship of the proletariat was the highest form of capitalism, meaning capitalism brought to highest level of politics and hence of potentially working through its social self-contradictions, and not yet socialism, meaning not yet even the overcoming of capitalism. By equating the capitalist welfare state with socialism, with the only remaining criterion, the democratic self-governance of the working class, Miliband, by contrast, elided the crucial Marxist distinction between the dictatorship of the proletariat and socialism. For Miliband, what made the state socialist or not was the degree of supposed workers' democracy. In this way, Miliband serves very well to articulate the current Jacobin DSA identification of its political goals with democratic socialism. But like Miliband, Jacobin DSA falls prey to the issue of the policies pursued by the state as the criterion of socialism. However, without Miliband's recognition of the difference between social democratic welfare state policies pursued by capitalist politicians versus by the working class itself. Lenin pursued the political and social power, the social and political revolution of the working class, as not the ultimate goal, but rather the next necessary step in the history of capitalism, leading, hopefully, to its self-overcoming in socialism. As a Marxist, Lenin was very sober and clear-eyed, unsentimental, about the actual political and social tasks of the struggle for socialism, what they were and what they were not. In harking back to the manifest impasse of the mid-20th century capitalist welfare state, registered by Miliband, however, through identifying this with the alleged limits of Lenin's and the greater Marxism's consciousness of the problem, but without proper recognition of its true nature in capitalism, those such as Jacobin DSA actively obfuscate, bury, and forget not Marxism such as Lenin's, or the goal of socialism, but rather the actual problem of capitalism they are trying to confront, obscuring it still further. The left today, such as DSA Jacobin, wants the restoration of pre-neoliberal progressive capitalism, for instance, the pre-neoliberal politics of the UK Labour Party, or indeed simply the pre-neoliberal Democrats. Their misuse of the label socialism and abuse of Marxism, including even the memory of Lenin and their bandying about of the word revolution, is overwrought and in the service of progressive capitalism. This is an utter travesty of socialism, Marxism, and the memory of Lenin. On the 150th anniversary of Lenin's birth, we owe him, at least, the thought that what he consciously recognized and actually pursued as a Marxist be remembered properly and not falsified, and certainly not in the interest of seeking, by sharp contrast to Lenin, the democratic legitimation of capitalism, which even liberals such as Ralph Miliband acknowledged to be a deep problem afflicting contemporary society and its supposed welfare state. by reckoning with what Marxists, such as Lenin, understood as the real problem and actual political tasks of capitalism, there is yet hope that we will resume the true socialist pursuit of actually overcoming it. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. We've got one comment and a question, and then raised hand here. This is from George Gonzalez. In my book, Star Trek and the Politics of Globalism, I have a chapter titled Star Trek and the Marxist Theory of the State. Star Trek shows that within Marxism, there is a distinction between a state and a government. A state is intended, designed to repress the public and defend the social order. A government is needed to maximize the benefits of modernity as an organizing entity and to uphold and normalize the justice regime of a post-capitalist regime.
Okay, let me just say, of course, I'm a fan of Star Trek. This distinction between the state and government is important. However, we have to pay attention to why Marx and Lenin define the state as, Marxism in general, old style historical Marxism, define the state as not the constitutional legal order, right, not the system of social rights, but rather special bodies of armed men, which is again different from the government. So for instance, in the United States today, we have a government, right? And we have an executive branch, a government by Donald Trump and the Republican Party. However, there is a state that is broader than that government. And that state is, of course, the special bodies of armed men, the FBI, the CIA, the military, and of course, broken up into local jurisdictions, state governments, and municipal authorities, including police forces. So the National Guard at a state level and local police. This is what Marxism called the state. And that state was what was meant to wither away as capitalism was overcome and socialism was achieved. So it can't be abolished at one stroke. Even the replacement of government employees, specially deputized armed people, by the armed population is still the state in Marxist terms, and that still had to wither away in overcoming capitalism and achieving socialism. The other point that I'd make with regard to the state and government and the special bodies of our men is the historical perspective. In other words, the reason that Marxism defined the state the way they did was that the state, while apparently an ancient phenomenon, was actually a recent phenomenon, was actually something that had developed with capitalism itself, had emerged with the Industrial Revolution. And by that is meant police forces, prisons, a professional, mass standing army that, in particular, though, if we look at police and prisons, they emerge contemporaneously with the Industrial Revolution. And so they have a specific role with regard to the proletarianized working class in industrial capitalism. Namely, you need a police force to control the reserve army of surplus labor in a way that previously was not necessary. Of course, prior to capitalism and really prior to bourgeois society, we might refer to the state as like the aristocracy, the warrior caste that militarily and by force subjugated society. But we mean something else when we're talking about the state in capitalism, right? We don't live in an aristocratic state, warrior caste state, or a monarchical state. We live in a modern capitalist state, and for a long time now, since the early 19th century at the latest. And again, that state, the special bodies of our men, is a phenomenon of capitalism, is a symptom of capitalism, and can only be overcome as capitalism is overcome. And just as capitalism cannot be overcome in one stroke or all at once, neither can the state, at least according to Marx and Lenin. Now, there is another phrase that is interesting in the history of Marxism, and that's Engels, his formulation that socialism or communism, but let's just call it socialism, replaces the governing of men with the administration of things. So the governing of men understood as political force versus the administration of things, which would be somewhat different, right? In other words, there is in Marxism also a way of addressing the question of governance. What do we mean by governing? And again, Marxism would take governing to mean the exercise of political force, as opposed to the administration of things. So I would recall that history of formulations in Marxism to address that distinction between the state and government. Famously, Marx said that the call for a free state in the SPD's program in 1875, the Gotha program, was a contradiction in terms, because insofar as people are free, the state will not be necessary. All right, so again, the state as an index of unfreedom, and unfreedom being understood as a phenomenon of capitalism itself, and specifically the contradiction in capitalist production. The contradiction between bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. In The State and Revolution, in a part that most people neglect, Lenin talks about the persistence of the state being a phenomenon of the persistence of bourgeois right. And by bourgeois right, bourgeois law, bourgeois Recht in the German sense, what was meant was the social relations of labor. Insofar as bourgeois right was still operant, the state would be necessary. Why so? Because again, capitalism is understood by Marxism as the persistence of a social and political regime of bourgeois right under conditions of industrial production that undermine the bourgeois social rights of labor. So insofar as capitalism is not yet overcome, bourgeois right is not yet overcome, and therefore, even after you get rid of the capitalist bourgeoisie, a state would be necessary. A kind of self-repression of the working class would still be necessary so long as the contradiction of capitalist production still affected society.
We've next got a hand raised from Richard, so I'm going to unmute you, Richard.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So your description about the relationship between Leninism and Stalinism was very much an orthodox Trotskyist one. I was just going to point that out. But if I could move from the question of Lenin and the DSA, etc., Jacobin not getting Lenin, to the question of Leninism and its meaning in the present. So we are, whether for whatever reason, stuck with the legacy of the 20th century. And so the question of Leninism in the 20th century, and also conversely of social democracy, is essentially as follows: that all of those regimes that in some parts of the globe, essentially relatively backward parts of the globe, expropriated the bourgeoisie, that were led by Leninist parties, or maybe Castro wasn't led by a Leninist party. So that was part of the mystique of Leninism, right? And all of those also were dictatorships, right? And all of them fell below the basic standards of what we would call bourgeois democracy. Conversely, all of the parties that rejected Leninism, and even some that nominally were Leninist, like certain mass Stalinist parties like the Italian, actually these social democratic parties never were able in any advanced capitalist country to engage in a social revolution, to expropriate the bourgeoisie, to actually really do anything about capitalism except implement reform. And since the collapse of, since 89, 91, we're essentially left with a situation where the question is raised, is there any point in pursuing an actual Leninist politics today, right? In other words, you could draw the lesson from the 20th century that Leninism, and we're not only talking about Stalinism, but we're talking about like all the Trotskyist micro-parties, right? That the best you could accomplish by forming any type of Leninist party, whatever its program, however good its program, would be just another micro-party, right? In other words, and you could also draw the lesson, right? A lesson which is counterposed to exactly the lesson that Trotsky draws, that the right-wing argument that you can't expropriate the bourgeoisie, right, in the way that was done, and that this image of the dictatorship of the proletariat is itself an illusion. In other words, what is there then in this Leninist political tradition that goes through the 20th century, not just like some defense of Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution, but what is it that can be now when we're almost a fifth of the way through the 21st century? What can be acted upon in the present? Because it seems to me, that one of the issues in Platypus from the beginning is, well, Platypus in a sense, a theoretical sense, defends Lenin, that the practical outlook towards which, I mean, and defends Lenin in essentially a Trotskyist sense, the practical political tendency of Platypus would be to look towards some kind of neo-Kautskyism. In that sense, it's very similar to the CPGB, right?
Mm-hmm.
If anything were seen to be possible. So the question is that essentially the only thing one can look forward to in the future? To say, well, we're not actually literally going to build Leninist parties. We're going to try to rebuild mass social or democratic parties, but that would be revolutionary. And that's really what's appropriate to advance capitalist societies.
Okay, so let me address this, because I think this is very important. So it depends on how one defines Leninism. And there is a problem with regard to both that Trotskyism and Stalinism have in common, namely the status of the Third International, the Communist International, and its perspectives in Lenin's own lifetime. In other words, the supposed first, few congresses of the Third International as the basis for Trotskyism, but also it's the basis for Stalinism as well. So this is the shared tradition. Leninism, like some articulated programmatic distinction.
Or Maoism with Marxism.
Maoism would also. So what it points to is really the division in Marxism itself. So Richard, you mentioned Kautskyism or neo-Kautskyism. So generally speaking, both Stalinism and Trotskyism emphasize the break from Second International Marxism, from social democracy, that occurred in World War I and the revolutions that followed World War I. So that break is obviously very significant. However, by emphasizing the break, what is neglected is the continuity. In other words, Lenin considered the Second International to have betrayed itself, to have betrayed Marxism, to have betrayed its own program.
And that forced the break on him. And that forced the break on him.
That's right.
He didn't want the break, but the break was forced, and he emphasized the importance of the break, did he not?
That's right, he did. And so, that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that the experience of that betrayal, the experience of the betrayal of the Second International, the self-betrayal of revolutionary social democracy. So Kautsky described himself not merely as a social democrat, but as a revolutionary social democrat. And that term is tricky. I've addressed it in an article called What Was Social Democracy? The reason that they used that term was in order to uphold the tradition of 1848. In other words, to say, we stand for succeeding where the 1848 revolutions failed. Namely, we want to achieve the social republic. We want to achieve social democracy in that sense, which Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, before World War I, this is how they described their program, their perspective. in sync with Kautsky and, you know, the other official leaders of the Second International, like August Bebel, who was the longtime chairman of the SPD, but who died right before World War I. So we don't know whether he would have betrayed or not. Maybe, maybe not. So the break, right, was in a sense forced by the betrayal, but then the lessons of the betrayal are also there to be considered. Namely, why did the SPD betray itself? And did the Third International try to base itself on lessons learned from that betrayal? In other words, not simply upholding the revolutionary social democratic tradition of Second International Marxism, but also trying to improve upon it. Now, I think that that's actually an open question. In other words, whether the lessons of the betrayal were learned, and in a sense, could they be learned? So I would emphasize rather yet another way of thinking about it. So not only in terms of the break, the betrayal, and the lessons learned from the betrayal, but also the question of the competition between the Third and the Second International, meaning the Third International was founded in a context in which the majority of socialists were still part of the old Second International. And that remained true for quite some time. And so it was a polemical entity, the Third International. The new communist parties of the Third International were in active political competition with the existing mass socialist parties of the Second International.
What about the competition between Stalinism and social democracy and its effect on the New Left?
Well,
Hence the Miliband.
I'll talk about that in a moment, but I wanted to emphasize the nature of the competition because, of course, Lenin is associated with a kind of vanguardism and a kind of minority political action, right? So the action of a spirited minority vanguard party, as opposed to the mass socialist parties that are understood in some way. I mean, this is a fundamental ambivalence here with regard to both Trotskyism and Stalinism about the mass socialist parties. It's almost thought of that, well, the problem with those parties and why they betrayed socialism was because they were such massive parties, because they were mass parties. And therefore they were ideologically heterogeneous. They contained too many backward elements of the working class and also of the supposedly revolutionary petty bourgeois intelligentsia, and that you needed a narrower party, more tightly ideologically homogeneous and organizationally disciplined than the old mass parties. Now that's the real sticking point, right? In other words, when we think of Leninism, what Stalinism and Trotskyism have in common is this idea of a more ideologically homogeneous and organizationally disciplined vanguard party, which suggests a kind of minoritarian and even a putschist perspective, right? That this is really the issue. It certainly is the issue that Miliband addresses when he talks about revolutionary authority, socialist authority, the problem of socialist authority, the problem of revolutionary authority. Now, in terms of the mass socialist parties, the basic perspective of Marxism, and this is true whether pre-World War I social democracy, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, they would all say, Mao would say, and Che and Fidel, right? They would say, well, of course, the achievement of socialism requires the self-activity of the working class and even the broader petty bourgeois democratic masses themselves. In other words, the party can't actually make socialism happen. It depends on the people. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why the Stalinist parties just gave up in 1989 to 1991. In other words, why was there not a civil war in the fall of official communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union? Because at the end of the day, their ostensible ideology was, it depends on the people. And so when the people demonstrated that they didn't want this regime, then the Stalinists said, okay, you don't want it, we give up, right? So all of this is to say that, of course, Marxism thought of itself in all of its varieties as essentially democratic. and that the role of the party, however understood, whether a mass, heterogeneous, loosely organized, or a narrower, more tightly organized and ideologically homogeneous party, is not itself meant to achieve socialism. It's meant to facilitate the masses' own activity in overcoming capitalism and achieving socialism. And I think that that's really the sticking point. And that's where, like, Miliband was talking about, in terms of parliamentary socialism, the UK Labour Party, with Clause 4, with its perspective of supposed socialism, and why Miliband would even be interested in talking about Lenin and talking about the state and revolution, is that it raises this question. Well, okay, mass action, democracy, the self-activity of the masses still doesn't speak to the issue of political authority. What is the role of political authority? Now, the unfortunate thing there is that Miliband kind of follows Lenin's The State and Revolution in just talking about authority with respect to the state. What I would say is that you would have to distinguish between the political leadership of a party and state authority. State authority is different from the political authority of leadership, and that conflation is also kind of fatal, in the sense that it really obscures the matter, right? So if we just say, well, the authority of the law, or the authority of the constitutional regime, the authority of the ostensible principles of the state, there's a lot that can be kind of hidden and submerged in thinking about that. So even when we talk about, like, the undemocratic nature of the East Bloc, of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact countries, communist China, well, in what way are they undemocratic? Generally speaking, they're called undemocratic because they're single-party dictatorships or single-party states, right? We don't even have to say, are they dictatorships? Because there's a lot of internal democracy that goes on within these parties, however bureaucratically manipulated. Nonetheless, they still go through some formal process of a democratic procedure. And so usually the argument about the undemocratic nature of these states is essentially a liberal argument, that you don't have multiple parties, and also that you don't have civil rights against the state. In other words, that the rights of society against the state are not observed. And a phenomenon of that, of course, is the right for people to organize independent political parties independent of the state. And that's a liberal conception. What I would argue is that before Stalinism, that Marxists such as Lenin and Trotsky understood that political parties are civil social organizations. In other words, because of their experience in pre-World War I, Second International Marxism, it was an obvious point that these social democratic parties were not state institutions, right? Because they were excluded from government, of course, but also because they couldn't implement their program under the legal constitutional order. That they depended for their existence on civil liberties, on social rights independent from the state. Now, of course, it's the success of the revolution in the Russian Revolution of 1917 that then brings up this question of, okay, well, when the socialists achieve their political aims, what happens to the civil social freedoms on which the struggle for socialism up to that point was based? Right? It seems to go away. It seems like, well, the socialists are only in favor of civil social freedoms so long as they're out of power. But once they're in power, then the dictatorship of the proletariat means that society becomes statified. There are no civil liberties. Even if there's a nominal democracy, it's a kind of majoritarian, repressive, authoritarian democracy.
Chris,
right?
weren't there in fact two related questions? So there's the question of the civil rights of, say, bourgeois parties to organize against socialism, just the way socialists, right, their civil rights. But there's also the question of the civil rights of alternative socialist parties,
yes,
right, that have different. And it's it's a lot of the left-wing criticism of Leninism is, well, maybe you have a right to suppress the bourgeois parties, they're anti-socialist, but also in practice, there was a suppression of fellow socialists who
Yes.
disagreed. And then you have the
Yes.
question about to what extent was that accidental, right? So a lot of the
Right.
later defense would say, well, this was just an accident, right, caused by the Civil War. And the norm, right, the ideal, the socialist norm would be a multi-party socialist democracy in which multiple socialist parties, all committed to a socialist order, would be allowed to compete.
That's right. And so what I'd say about that is that, of course, that's a pre-Third International perspective, but it's also a perspective that Lenin retained. In other words, when you say, was it an accident? The single-party dictatorship, was it an accident that then became institutionalized? Although in a curious way, it's also not institutionalized, but I'll get to that in a minute. So for instance, the October Revolution of 1917 was in fact a multi-party regime. It included the Bolsheviks and it included the left socialist revolutionaries. It also included some others. And the Bolshevik Party itself had absorbed a left-wing Menshevik group, Trotsky and his collaborators.
Yeah,
so
but not after 1918. I mean,
right,
that lasted for a very short time.
So what happened? What happened was that the left socialist revolutionaries objected to the policy of the Bolsheviks in signing the peace with Germany. And the way they objected was to blow up Bolshevik party headquarters in Moscow and try to assassinate several Bolshevik governing officials, including Lenin himself. So that's what started the Civil War. It's what started the Red Terror. And even thereafter, right, the form of the single party dictatorship, so to speak, was simply the exclusion of parties running candidates in the Soviet elections unless they agreed with the Soviet Constitution. And I always like to point out that in the United States, in fact, in order to take office, like if you want to run for Congress, or if you want to run for the presidency, or if you want to run for even local office, you can't actually take office unless you swear to abide by the constitutional order, right? So people who don't agree with the US constitutional order cannot take office, right? So you have to, you might want to change the Constitution, but you have to agree to change the Constitution constitutionally. In other words, you have to agree with the constitutional procedure for changing the Constitution. And that's how the parties were excluded in early Soviet Russia. That's how it happened. It didn't happen because, you know, Lenin woke up one day, or Lenin and Trotsky woke up one day and said, you know what, we don't want to deal with the other parties, we just want our own party. That's not how it happened. Now later, Stalinism kind of fudges this, and one of the fascinating things is the way Stalinism fudges this, how it evolves into a kind of fudging of the issue. So what happened in the 1920s and into the 1930s was that as the Soviet Union stabilized and as the Russian Revolution proved to be a success, a lot of the opponents of the Bolsheviks came back and wanted to participate in Soviet politics, and they did so by joining the Bolshevik Party. So a lot of Mensheviks, a lot of former socialist revolutionaries, a lot of former Russian nationalists, monarchists, just said, you know what, I'm a communist now. I'm going to join the Communist Party. That happened, right? And Trotsky considered that to be the liquidation of the party, the liquidation of the party. In other words, as the worst possible outcome. So rather than admitting other parties into the representative and governing structure of the Soviet Union, instead, these people just joined the Communist Party. So that's a strange irony of history. There are also other examples. For instance, I like to point out that East Germany, the Democratic Republic of Germany, after World War II, the Socialist Unity Party was a party formed by the old SPD and the Communist Party in the Eastern Zone. In other words, the former SPD, who were of course anti-Nazi and part of the anti-Nazi resistance, and the Communist Party formed a unitary party, the Socialist Unity Party. And so that's another bizarre way in which, rather than a multi-party system, they just fused the two parties into one party. So, you know, and there are other examples that you could look at in terms of the history of official communism that bear these kinds of, you know, strange results. In terms of the question of political freedom and liberal democracy. In other words, why was Ralph Miliband attacking Lenin, but also attacking Marxism for being unclear about the question of democracy and socialism, what he meant by democracy and socialism, and what it meant to oppose Stalinism as undemocratic. Now, you know, in my presentation, I just wanted to point out that Miliband didn't think that this was a problem exclusive to Lenin or to Marxism. He also thought it was a problem in the UK of his time. He thought it was a problem of the Labour Party. In other words, the political order, the state, if you will, and its opposition party at that time, the Labour Party, which claimed to be socialist, also evinced this problem. It evinced the problem of democracy, of the democratic or undemocratic nature of the state, and what that means with regard to socialism. So he didn't just say, look, this is a Marxist problem, this is a problem of Leninism, because, you know, of course, in taking up Lenin, he was very much aware that he's addressing not only Stalinism, but also Trotskyism. Trotskyism had a significant presence in the UK, and he is familiar with and in dialogue with Trotskyists of the time as well. But he did think that the problem was broader than some deficiency in Marxism. And again, it's that kind of question that even a liberal could raise, like Miliband, that people today, like the DSA Jacobin, just completely forget, right? They forget that apart from the nominal positions or theories of Marxism, there's actually a broader problem of democracy in capitalism.
So we've got quite a queue. I'll read two comments that are in line with this and then a question from Eno. So George Gonzalez says, the relationship of the state and government needs to be fully theorized. Put differently, the idea of statism is liberal calumny directed against the use of government to achieve social democracy or social justice and democracy. And then he says, interestingly, on the far right, as the state becomes more repressive, remote, the more the idea of government as justice mechanism is vilified. And then we have a question from Eno. Isn't the reproduction of the dominant ideology mechanisms like educational system, etc., play a fundamental role of the state in line with Althusser's view of ideology? What is the link of this view with Marxism and Leninism?
Okay, so, right. So I would say in response to George Gonzalez, his question, that this is really a phenomenon of neoliberalism, very strongly neoliberalism, but also preceding neoliberalism, what's called ordoliberalism, right? So before the neoliberal era, there are these dissident old-style classical liberals, the ordo-liberals like Hayek and others, who really raise this question. And I would say that it's much easier for us to see this in neoliberal terms, that it's just calumny directed at the welfare state. What tends to be forgotten is just how much even Hayek, and certainly someone like Milton Friedman, simply assumed the welfare state. In other words, they didn't like certain aspects of the welfare state. They didn't like its bureaucratic aspect, but they also assumed its necessity. They assumed that conditions of advanced modern capitalism simply require a welfare state. So someone like Milton Friedman, he preferred a universal basic income form of welfare state rather than a bureaucratically administered welfare state, right? So he supported monetary redistribution. but attacked bureaucratic administration. So what we got was neither, right? In other words, we didn't get the continuation of the old welfare state, nor did we get this Milton Friedman UBI kind of liberal welfare state, unbureaucratic welfare state. What we got was in some ways the worst of both worlds. So we didn't get a UBI, and we retained bureaucratic administration, but we just cut its funds. So we retained the repressive aspect, but we put it under conditions of austerity. And the reason for that, it's a rather deep question. So Friedman and Hayek, these people, they advocated what they advocated in the era. Of course, their perspective was based on an earlier time, but they were strong advocates of freeing society from the bureaucratic administrative welfare state in the era of capitalist prosperity in the 50s and 60s. And so their program was based on that capitalist prosperity. When capitalism suffered a downturn in the 1970s, it was only then that their ideology was partially appropriated, partially taken up. It was taken up, so my old mentor Adolf Reed likes to talk about this, about how neoliberalism has two demands. It has the demand of free market, and it has demand of upward redistribution of wealth. In other words, preserving the wealth of the capitalists, but also freeing society in a kind of opening up the market. But that in practice, what you get is more upward redistribution of wealth than you get actual free market. And in other words, you still have a lot of statism, but you have statism subject to austerity, and you have so-called privatization, right? Which privatization doesn't really mean turning things over to the free market. It means allowing private capitalists to have more of a say over government contracts and the terms of government contracts. So again, privatization is a little bit of a misnomer as well. But again, within neoliberalism, we have this misunderstanding, I think, which is that the public sector is socialist and the private sector is capitalist. Marxism didn't think of things that way. Certainly Lenin, in terms of his perspective on imperialism and monopoly capitalism and the cartelization of capitalism in advanced industrial capitalism, he would not have considered the public sector to be socialist and the private sector to be capitalist, right? It wouldn't have corresponded, but this is what it's come to mean in the era of neoliberalism. So I think we have to beware some distortions that come with neoliberalism itself, including its ideology, because I would say that the ostensible ideology of the actual neoliberals like Milton Friedman was only partially adopted, partially appropriated, and distorted, in fact. So we didn't get a UBI, and we didn't get the dismantling of the administrative state. Instead, the administrative state remains. It remains a bureaucratic, administrative, repressive state, but we have it subject to austerity after the downturn of capitalism, lower profits, the general lowering of profits after the 1973 crash. Now, in terms of the ideological state apparatuses of, Althusser, the ideological state apparatuses, I think that's also a fudging of the issue. So what he did was he distinguished the repressive state apparatus, the special bodies of armed men that Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and others defined as the state. He said, well, the state's not only that, the state is also the ideological apparatus. Now, in a place like France, right, schools are public institutions. Higher education is a state operation. In the United States, of course, most higher education is private. So that distinction would have to be made. The other distinction in terms of ideological state apparatuses is the church, religion. And France, despite everything, is a Catholic country, meaning it's a nominally secular state, but there is a majority religion, and the status of the Catholic Church in France in Althusser's own time would have been very different from the status of religion in the United States, for example. So his examples of the ideological state apparatuses, schools, religion, the church, are specific. And so we have to be careful about that. You know, we can slide easily into a Foucauldian, you know, Foucault, who was a student of Althusser, but Althusser said that Foucault only ran with one of his ideas. I'm not sure which of the ideas he ran with, but let's say that it is the idea of the ideological state apparatus. In other words, that besides the physical repressive force of the state, there's also the disciplinary function of the state, or the soft power of ideological control, as opposed to physical force. I think that we should beware of that idea, which also blended in with other things contemporaneous, such as the Maoist cultural revolution idea, right? The idea that one has to fight ideology within oneself through a process of self-criticism. I think that all of this really avoids the fundamental core issue of politics. In other words, by broadening it to the question of culture and ideology, I think that we just liquidate politics. And again, in Althusser's time and in Foucault's time, you look at the professoriate of higher education in France, and lo and behold, what do you find? A hell of a lot of Communist Party members, right? So the discontents in the 60s in France are all about the fact that the nominally revolutionary Socialist Party, the Communist Party of France, is actually part of the Gaullist state. And certainly, even if it can't be seen as part of the Gaullist state in its repressive aspect, it certainly is part of the ideological apparatus of the Gaullist state. Again, that's not our situation in the United States. As much as Maoism did the long march through the institutions and infiltrated academia in the United States, this is not, you know, this is not what we're dealing with today. And there are real pitfalls to trying to adopt the perspective of the 60s, especially from a country like France, onto our contemporary political situation more than 50 years later.
So we've got a raised hand from Pam.
Mm-hmm.
You can go, Pam.
Thanks. So, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
How is Lenin's political strategy transformed by the break from the Second International, which was forced upon him by World War I? And within this discontinuity, what is the thread of continuity in the legacy with Marx and Engels?
Okay, so, right. When there was this crisis in Marxism, when there was this division in Marxism that took place, not only in the war, but in the revolutions that followed, because let's say the SPD had gone along with the war, but had supported the Bolshevik revolution in Russia. That would have changed things a great deal, no? But of course they didn't, right? So part of that division in Marxism was also a generational division. In other words, if you look at people like Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, they're a younger generation than the old official leadership of the SPD, although they're opposed by fellow younger generation people like Ebert and Scheidemann, and, you know, the leaders of the SPD at the end of World War I. Some of whom were Rosa Luxemburg's own students in the SPD's own party school, in fact. Some of her political opponents, the people who were complicit in her ultimate assassination, were her former students in the party school. But the younger generation, they, in a sense, took the SPD, took the Second International, the Marxism of the Second International at face value. In other words, they took it as Marxist. What's interesting about these figures is how they themselves through their self-education and through their political experience, rediscovered Marx and Engels, and really read Marx and Engels in a different way than the official leadership of the Second International did. And these are some subtle differences. They're really subtle differences, where the way Rosa Luxemburg puts it in 1918, at the founding of the Communist Party of Germany, she said 70 years of history have returned us to the perspective of Marx and Engels in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto. In other words, the achievement of the building up of a mass workers' movement for socialism is to arrive finally again at the tasks of the 1848 revolution. In other words, in 1918, the idea is we're going to make good on the failure of the revolution of 1848. We're going to succeed where previously it failed, and we're going to succeed on the basis of Marx and Engels' own perspective on the 1848 revolution, as articulated in the Communist Manifesto. Now, this raises all sorts of questions about Marxism, and specifically the relationship between theory and practice. So why, for instance, these communists like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin and Trotsky, why they consider themselves to be the true Marxists as opposed to the vulgar Marxists, the kind of falsifiers of Marxism, right? That kind of notion. And one way that they describe this, which is very obscure and deeply problematic, we have to say, because of its obscurity, is to say that Second International Marxism became undialectical. In other words, that what Luxemburg and Lenin and Trotsky did was rediscover the dialectical character of Marxism. Now, I've already spoken to this in my talk today, which is to say that Lenin understood the contradictions within the history of socialism and the contradictions, therefore, that arise within Marxism as a political movement to be part of capitalism. In other words, the idea is not that you have socialist principles on one side and capitalist principles on the other side, and they just oppose each other and one wins and the other loses, but rather the understanding going back to the 1840s, to the very young Marx. As a Hegelian, he understood that the socialist movement itself expressed the self-contradiction of society. In other words, that socialism was riven by the contradiction of capitalism, and that would remain the case. That would remain the case all the way up to the revolution and even after the seizure of power by socialists. So again, the idea that the self-contradiction of capitalism affects everything. It affects Marxism. It affects revolutionaries. And again, that the party is not some kind of dialectical mastermind that has overcome the contradiction, but rather that the party as a concrete political force also embodies that contradiction, also manifests within itself that social contradiction. Now, of course, this has given rise to all sorts of things like the Maoist cultural revolutionary bombard the party headquarters perspective, which is that, the final battle is between the capitalist roaders and the socialist roaders within the Communist Party itself. Now, I would say there might be a kernel of truth to that. The problem is that when Mao declared that in China, it was not really a problem of capitalist road versus socialist road. It was rather a problem of the industrialization of a peasant country.
Can I just go back to Lenin on this? Because, I'm sorry, just quick follow-up. When you talk about this socialism as still driven by the contradiction of capitalism and that this would remain the case, earlier in your presentation, you talked about this in terms of the state and the transformation of the state. So you said that once there is a dictatorship of the proletariat, then the state wouldn't serve the interest of capitalists, and yet it would serve the imperatives of capital, and thus will show that this is not yet overcoming capitalism. Could you talk about that difference, maybe?
Right. And this is where, again, the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's the coming to power, the political power, but also the social power by the working class. Now, not the working class in one country, especially not in a country where the wage laboring working class is a small minority, right? Because we're not talking about the industrial working class in terms of like factory labor. We're talking about the fact that in Russia in 1917, the majority of people were still subsistence agriculturalists. That's just real. Now, they were subject to debt relations, like obviously the money economy had permeated to a certain degree, but still the mode of production was not industrial capitalism, right? It was still largely peasant subsistence, on which capitalism depended, of course, in Tsarist Russia. So when we're talking about the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat, for the political and social power of the working class, it's got to be in a way that actually affects the world, right? It's got to be able to affect the global capitalist system. And not just negatively, not just in terms of carving out spaces that are no longer trading and exchanging, although the Soviet Union always did trade and exchange with the West, in fact, right? So we're not talking about that, right? We're talking about the core of capitalism. Can the working class come to a political and social position where it is now governing, ruling the core of capitalism, such that capitalism can be transformed into socialism? And that, of course, hasn't happened. So that would be the dictatorship of the proletariat. That has not happened. It can't happen in one country. It certainly can't happen in a majority peasant country, in terms of being in a position to have the working class lead the world beyond capitalism. No, right? That hasn't happened. So that's where, again, the perspective of a transition. This is, in fact, the most controversial point in Marxism. So this is what liberals take issue with. This is what non-Marxist socialists take issue with. It's what Democrats, small d Democrats, take issue with. They take issue with this perspective of the transition. So the transition from capitalism to socialism, the fact that Marxism distinguishes a transitional period at all, that they say, look, you can't implement socialism immediately. Capitalism can only be overcome gradually. That's actually the most, because that's why you need a dictatorship of the proletariat. That's why you need a specific political revolution. You need a political act to start this transition to socialism. And the fact that it's not instantaneously socialism, that there's a transition, this is actually the most controversial point in Marxism. It's what everyone rebels against about Marxism, because it seems to be a mindfuck. It seems to be, okay, so what you're saying is you need socialists to come to power, but they're going to be administering capitalism, and they need to remain in power so long as that transition is taking place. So it seems to be a way of legitimating a regime while also claiming that the regime is not actually resting on the basis of socialism, right? So it seems to be kind of evading political responsibility, actually, this claim of a transitional period. So this is Marx's great discovery, he thought, as to why and how a transition from capitalism to socialism must take place. And that's what he meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat. He meant capitalism has to be consciously overcome politically. In other words, it's not going to happen spontaneously. It's not going to be a DIY, local mutual aid, community, anarchist phenomenon. That's not how we're not going to develop a non-money economy in which we just barter our goods with each other, right, until we starve out the capitalist state by denying it taxes. That's like a David Graeber anarchist perspective, right? That's not how capitalism is going to be overcome, according to Marx. And therefore, he concludes from that you need a political revolution, and you need the political revolution to result in a regime, the dictatorship of the proletariat, in order to effect this transition. This is the most controversial point in Marxism, because it also claims that we don't have socialism now. Like, in other words, the working class now is not socialist. It doesn't have a socialist ethic. It doesn't have a socialist psychology. It doesn't have socialist social relations. It's rather capitalist. And not only that, it's bourgeois. The working class is bourgeois. The working class has bourgeois rights. So you can get rid of the bourgeoisie. You can kill all the capitalists, and you're still going to have bourgeois social relations. And where do those bourgeois social relations come from? They come from the workers themselves. Right? That idea. That's a controversial idea. Like, we can't, avoid that it's not prefigurative, right? That the point is not to just free the naturally socialist working class from capitalist domination by greedy capitalists, right? Because that's the idea. The idea is we just get rid of the capitalists and their rule of greed and profiteering, and then the people themselves will just be socialists. No, Marxism never thought that. Marxism thought you get rid of the capitalists and the workers will reestablish capitalism themselves. That the workers' own activity constantly regenerates capitalism, constantly regenerates bourgeois social relations. This is the Marxist critique of anarchism. And again, it's why they had the political strategy that they had for the dictatorship of the proletariat. And whether or not it's true, whether or not Marxism was right about that, that is Marxism, right? It isn't this Noam Chomsky idea, which is that Gallup poll shows that 70% of people already support socialism, right? This is what Chomsky will run around saying. He'll say, he's an anarchist, of course, says the people already want socialism. They're just denied it by manufactured consent by the rich people who manipulate politics. That's not what Marxism thinks. No. It's not what Lenin thought.
A question connected to that in the background from Tatiana Jukic. What do you think was and or remains revolutionary about the Industrial Revolution then, especially in light of Lenin's perspective on industrialization? I'm alluding also to a recent essay by J.L. Nancy where Lenin's take on industrialization is foregrounded as crucial.
Jean-Luc Nancy, who's a conservative philosopher. Like, we have to be very clear about who Nancy is. Nancy is a conservative philosopher. He's a Heideggerian. So yes, industrialization. And of course, Heidegger had his own perspective on industry and industrialization, on technology. So how is industrialization revolutionary? Well, it's revolutionary in that it undermines the foundations of bourgeois society. It undermines the social rights of labor. It undermines the value of labor as a commodity. It creates a contradiction between capital and labor, which Marx understood as the self-contradiction of labor. In other words, that capital was simply alienated labor, and therefore the contradiction between capital and labor is from within labor itself. So what does that mean? It means labor has become self-contradictory as a social relation due to the Industrial Revolution, due to the broadening of social production, so that it's no longer a matter of individual and collective human activity, but is rather the activity of what Marx called the general social intellect, which we would, for some concrete examples, we'd look at science and technology. That actually production now is more according to science and technology, or at least as much driven by science and technology as it is by the value of labor exchanged as a commodity. And yet, right, capitalism is the contradiction of these two things. You have to work for a living, but actual material concrete production is not a function of human activity as much as it's a function of scientific and technical processes. And again, the organization of production, of social production, is affected by this contradiction, the contradiction between the actual material value of labor as a commodity versus the results of scientific and technical production. So industrialization is revolutionary in that it means that we have to overcome bourgeois society. So we live in a society where more or less the rights of labor govern our institutions, our social relations. Wage labor, the property system, property understood as based on labor, that you own yourself, that you belong to yourself, that you're your own legal subject over yourself, and that you enter into an employment contract, that you're a freely contractual subject. That's the rights of labor. And yet the actual activity of society as a whole is not governed by that. It's not governed by the interaction and cooperation of subjects of the social rights of labor. It's as much determined by scientific and technical forces of production, industrial forces of production, and therefore it's revolutionary in that sense, meaning it's industry overturns bourgeois society, and it does so over and over again. In other words, that process began in the first industrial revolution in the late 18th century, really manifesting fully in the 19th century, and we've gone through several industrial revolutions since then, in which industry has revolutionized society and continues to revolutionize society at a practical level, at a practical social collective level. Our society is in a constant state of upheaval due to industrialization. Now, the question is, what does that say about the political task? Meaning, what are we supposed to do about that politically? Achieve socialism. How, right? How are we supposed to do that? Again, this is the deep question. Now, it's natural for us to, in a sense, blame technology or to seek salvation through technology. In other words, to see technology itself as this ambivalent force for good and for ill. And again, that would be the Heideggerian perspective, is that it's like Marx's sorcerer's apprentice in the Communist Manifesto, who unleashes forces that he can't control. That's Heidegger's perspective on technology. But Marx thought that there was actually a political task that attended to that, which is that the sorcerer's apprentice needed to master the forces that had been unleashed. Whereas for Heidegger, and for Heideggerians, people following him, these conservative philosophers who come after Heidegger, postmodernists more generally, they're very skeptical about the ability for us to master the forces that we've unleashed. So the idea is that, yes, Marxism is very confident, it has this Enlightenment perspective, that we can master the forces that we've unleashed. Whereas the more pessimistic, romantic, philosophical tradition is skeptical and pessimistic about, and conservative, therefore, about our ability to actually master those forces that we've unleashed. And also that Marxism regards the forces of science and technology as not forces in themselves, but as social forces. In other words, there's an understanding that it's not technology per se, but it's our relation to technology, and it's how we use technology, and it's the place that technology occupies and the role that it plays in society, that it's primarily a matter of society and not primarily a technical matter. And that's why it's amenable, that again, the optimism of Marxism is that the problem of industrialization is amenable to a political task and ultimate resolution in socialism. What I mentioned earlier, that the governing of men can be replaced by the administration of things. That's a very optimistic view. There's, because politically it hasn't happened, it more appears to be the case that we are subject to forces of technology that we've unleashed, but that we can't actually control as a society.
So getting to that politics, we have at least 3 sets of questions. On the one hand, first, about the welfare state. So Jack asked early on, what does it mean to call the welfare state a police measure? And Jamie Kiesling I am interested in the distinction you pointed out between the welfare state as a police measure versus as a compromise for the working class. Many left activists who I encounter think that organizing the working class for the advancement of social welfare campaigns like Medicare for All, for example, will empower people so that they realize they have political agency and will then be able to wrest political power from the ruling classes through incrementally more socialist achievable demands. This is several steps regressed from historical socialist critique of a welfare state. There is, however, a right-wing critique of the welfare state as authoritarian, big government, stealing tax money, free handouts. Can you talk about this dynamic and also the socialist understanding critique of the welfare state as a police measure?
All right, so the welfare state as a police measure is pretty straightforward, When does the government hand out food in a natural disaster? And who hands out the food? The National Guard, the Army, the police, right? And why is it done? To maintain social order. Meaning, if the government doesn't distribute food to people in a natural disaster, then the people are just going to break into the stores and take it themselves. Which might be okay, except it can get out of control and people can fight each other over the food, right? In other words, why did the police step in, right? They don't step in because it's like, oh, well, we have to keep the food for the rich people or something. It's because the people are killing each other, stealing the food. That's why. So to avoid that, you can just have the government give the food away. But how are they going to control that process? In other words, how do you make people line up in an orderly way to collect the food that the government is distributing? You have to use force. In other words, you have to say, if you don't stay in line and follow the rules, then you're going to be forcibly removed from the line, or you might be arrested and put in jail, or you might be killed. Right? That's the welfare state. That is the welfare state. It comes out of an emergency situation. And what is that emergency situation? Capitalism. So ever since the Industrial Revolution, capitalism has produced a reserve army of unemployed people, a surplus labor population that's not employed. And so what do you do with those people? You can put them in jail, you can kill them, you can feed them, or you can give them jobs. The government can give them jobs that private entrepreneurs are unable to provide. But in all cases, it's more or less a police measure. Right, so they're talking about how now they're going to have coronavirus trackers, right? To reopen the economy, we're going to have to be able to contain outbreaks. And how do you contain outbreaks? You do it through contact tracing. And where are all the people going to come from to do this contact tracing? Well, the government is going to have to hire them. And if the government hires them, right, to control the spread of a virus in the population, like it also helps, like I heard someone on the news say yesterday, well, now we have all these unemployed people, so there's a ready pool of applicants to hire to hunt down the virus carriers and contain them. And of course, that would be in the form of like social workers. And if people don't listen to the social workers, then what? Then the police come in. Right? In other words, if push comes to shove, force has to be exercised, merely threatened. But in any case, it's about the police state. It's about the state that emerged with the Industrial Revolution. You wouldn't have had a welfare state before there was a police state. And you never will have a welfare state that is not also a police state. It's the relationship between those two, their inextricable character, that we have to pay attention to. Why do people need welfare? For the same reason that we need police and jails.
So going to the other set of questions then, if it's not a welfare state, but the the Soviet politicization of industrialization from Tio, we have any comments on how Lenin stands accused of transferring power from the Soviets to the party? People don't seem to register how perhaps Soviets themselves degenerated due to specific conditions that were not intentionally degraded by Lenin. And in connection with that, Richard asks, if a socialist revolution expropriates the bourgeoisie, is not the immediate consequence state domination of the economy? Was this not the actual consequence of the Bolshevik Revolution?
Yes, that's right. Yes. I would say that, okay, so the actual history of the Soviet Union and the history of the Bolshevik regime in the early Soviet Union. So indeed, what happened was that the initiative passed from the broader masses and broader working class to the party. In other words, generally speaking, the active agency shifted from the workers themselves in the workers' councils and the peasants through, there were peasant councils, but especially through the soldiers' councils. Again, at the end of World War I is how the revolution happened. And so a lot of the peasantry were mobilized as soldiers, and the way they took part in the revolution was as soldiers, so in soldiers' councils. That generally speaking, the initiative passed from the workers and soldiers' councils to the party. Now, whether or not like Lenin is to blame for that, or the Bolsheviks more generally are to blame for that, it's possible that they did certain things that strengthen this tendency for the party to assume more of the initiative as opposed to the masses of the people. But we do have to, again, reckon with the fact that this happened. And so the party domination might have been less the cause than the effect. Now, what that means is that we don't have any evidence. We don't have any evidence that popular participatory democracy on the part of the working class will in fact lead to socialism, will in fact lead to this popular self-activity of the working class to reorganize production and overcome the social relations of labor and capitalism. We don't have any evidence that this can happen. We don't. Now, usually the reason for that is that economic necessities drove political necessities in the Soviet Union such that the state had to assume repressive power over society. I think that it's pretty clear that that indeed did happen, but that just begs the question of politically, how would you avoid that from happening? In other words, is that an inevitable political logic? Is it a function of the political form that it will inevitably lead to that or not? We don't know. We don't know that. We don't. Like, I would say that the Russian Revolution, and therefore the role of someone like Lenin, is deeply ambiguous as to outcome. We only know that he organized and led a political party that served a very important instrumental role in overthrowing a capitalist state, smashing it, and at least for a brief period, appearing to open the door to more popular participation in political life, and potentially leading to socialism. But we don't have any evidence that could have been the outcome. We don't know that. We don't. So I think that generally speaking, the Bolsheviks are blamed. I think that whether or not they're to blame, or whether it's possible that it's that the working class is incapable of overcoming capitalism in the way that Marxism assumed. So Marxism assumed that the working class could and must overcome capitalism through its own activity. That has not been proven. That has not been proven. And like I said, someone like Lenin, it's not a mere belief, it's not a sentiment on his part. You know, he thought of it as a concrete, material, practical possibility, but we don't have any evidence of that, in fact. So that is an open question. And it's a deep question. In other words, it's not a question that you can hold Lenin or Marxism responsible for. It's ultimately a question about the working class. In other words, you could say quite the opposite, that capitalism, the proletarianized working class of capitalism, is pulverized and atomized and debased and degraded to such an extent that it is incapable of taking power over society and leading it in a direction of freedom. That's possible too. It's possible that the working class is just, that capitalism subjects people to conditions that make them incapable of leading the world to freedom beyond capitalism. All right, again, that would be Heidegger, by the way. Heidegger's perspective is this, which is that the effect of capitalism on human beings is such that it precisely prevents them, disempowers them from escaping it.
So connected with that and bringing it back to Miliband, we have a question from John Thomore. I have a question about a point raised by Adorno in a letter to Benjamin in regards to Miliband's contention against Lenin's formulation of the party. Adorno comments to Benjamin that the proletariat is as much a part of bourgeois society, barring its interest in revolution, and otherwise bears all the marks of mutilation of the typical bourgeois character. Miliband states in his critique of Lenin's The State and Revolution that Lenin never fully addresses the role of the party in relation to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that is a downfall of Lenin's thought within the State and Revolution. Did Lenin not believe that before a change in consciousness could occur, that a change in society must occur first? And following up on this, wouldn't any sort of Milibandian revolution ultimately be built out of a reified consciousness which only perpetuates capitalism? And finally, is this the undoing of the Labor Party today?
Okay, that's a pretty big leap. That last part is a pretty big leap. So let's deal with it at the level of the role of the party, right? So the role of the party is specific. In other words, the party is not the be-all, end-all. So people like Lenin and also Trotsky and others like Rosa Luxemburg, they thought that there was such a thing as the workers' movement for socialism. In other words, a broad proletarian socialist movement of the post-industrial revolution working class. And they thought that the party was only a subset of that movement. In other words, you had labor unions, you had other civil social organizations that the working class created under conditions of industrial capitalism. And the Socialist Party claimed to represent and, in that sense, lead the broader movement. But it didn't encompass the entire movement. In other words, there were many union activists and other working class civil and social activists who were not Socialist Party members, and certainly were not under the kind of party discipline that Leninism conceives of, right? So the role of the party is specific to preparing and achieving the political revolution, right? The smashing of the capitalist state and the constitution of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, again, the party understood as like a metaphysical category. In other words, what's the role of a political party per se in the transition from capitalism to socialism? So this doesn't exclude that perhaps multiple parties claiming to want to achieve socialism will participate in this process. So we had to distinguish between the class, the proletarianized working class in capitalism, also the broader masses who are affected by capitalism, the democratic masses, the petty bourgeois masses, broader than just the wage laboring class per se. The movement, right? The self-organized movement of that class through things like labor unions and other civil social organizations. And then finally, the party or parties that are trying to achieve socialism, who are trying to take the political action necessary to achieve socialism. The political action of defeating the politics of the bourgeois parties and of other petty bourgeois democratic parties. Because, by the way, Marxism considered petty bourgeois democracy to be the deadliest enemy of socialism. More deadly an enemy than the high bourgeois capitalist parties, in fact. So the perspective here was one of the party playing a very specific role. Also, the state and the party were not to be the same thing. So for instance, when Lenin in The State and Revolution says that the state will no longer be constituted as it is under capitalism by special bodies of armed men, but rather by the armed people. Now, of course, the armed people, that's much broader than the party, certainly. It's also broader than the organized working class. It's also broader than the working class, per se. So the armed people also includes the petty bourgeoisie. It's not just the wage laborers. That would be the state, understood as a force of political repression. In other words, a way of exercising political force in society. So the idea is that it would be much broader than it is under capitalism, but it would still be distinguished from a society in which political force was no longer necessary, because that would be communism. That would be the higher stage of communism. That would be fully beyond bourgeois right and capitalism, would be a society that no longer required any exercise of political force whatsoever, even on the part of the armed people. That was the goal. That's the goal. So the role of the party is very specific. The role of the party is to achieve the dictatorship of the proletariat. And by the dictatorship of the proletariat, the political and social preponderance of the working class as the class that occupies a position in society where the contradiction of capitalism is most manifest, is most clearly manifest, the condition of wage labor under conditions of industrial production. So the idea is that the workers need to take power because they're driven by necessity to overcome capitalism and achieve socialism. And that's why this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat exists. Who in this society is most objectively driven to overcome the wage labor relation? The wage laborers themselves. That they have to take a leading role in the democratic reorganization of society. And how do they take that leading role? They do so through their own organizations, including the political parties that they themselves create. So there is, again, this role of the party is very specific. And in that respect, the role of the party withers away, diminishes in the dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, the dictatorship of the proletariat, that transition is also a transition. It's a transition of the withering away of the state. In some ways, more immediately, even before the withering away of the state, the role of the party would also wither away. Because the party is really about preparing and achieving the dictatorship of the proletariat, after which its role changes and indeed diminishes.
That can be understood in a number of ways. We have a question from Stefan. In an anniversary article of the German Cliffites, Marx 21, I read today that Lenin's conception was wrong. The working class did not need anything from outside to achieve class consciousness. What does it mean if one tries to clean Lenin of that concept? What did Lenin mean by consciousness from without? With regard to this, did proletarian and bourgeois consciousness mean for Leninism?
Okay, so Lenin's idea, so it's not in the State and Revolution, it's in What is to be Done. The idea that socialist consciousness comes from outside the working class, that the working class on its own can only achieve trade union consciousness. What does that mean? It means collective bargaining consciousness. And that is with respect not only to bargaining with employers, but bargaining with society as a whole. So trade union consciousness would also be the political practice of making demands on the state. So demanding a limitation of working hours, a demanding of a higher level of subsistence, political demands, that's all considered trade union consciousness. In other words, it's a collective bargaining consciousness of the workers in capitalism. It's not just the individual employment contract with the boss. It's not just the workers at a firm against the employers, but more broadly, what are the demands of the workers in terms of what they need to reproduce their labor power, right? So that's trade union consciousness, trade union consciousness. Socialist consciousness comes from outside the working class's trade union consciousness. But where is that outside? What is that outside? It's not a sociological outside. It's not about that. It's not about that it needs to come from people who are not wage laborers. Rather, it comes from a historical outside. In other words, it comes from a perspective of history that isn't reducible to the immediate needs of wage labor in any particular moment in the history of capitalism. So it's a perspective that transcends, the perspective of socialism transcends the concrete material needs and demands of the working class at any given moment in capitalism. So it's a long-term view. And of course, historically, that long-term view on socialism had as its repository the socialist intelligentsia, some of whom came from the capitalist class, like Engels, some of whom came from the petty bourgeoisie, like Marx, but some of the socialist intelligentsia came from the working class itself. So Proudhon, for example, Weitling, there are many examples of workers who themselves become socialist intellectuals and who maintain this perspective on the historical goal of socialism that transcends the immediate needs of the working class at any given time in capitalism. That's the outside, right? In other words, the idea that the party is the place where the immediate needs of the working class and the long-term perspective of socialism come together. Now, this can be understood concretely in sociological terms. It can be understood the way they understood it in the Second International, because Lenin didn't invent this. This is actually from Kautsky and others in the Second International. The merger formula, that the socialist movement was a union, a merger of the workers' movement in its trade union consciousness, right? And the movement of the socialist intelligentsia, which was a bohemian, radical, revolutionary movement going back to the time of the French Revolution, to Babeuf, the conspiracy of equals, the Jacobins. And that they came together in the Socialist Party of the late 19th century. Those two strands came together in the Socialist Party, and that this is what made the goal of socialism concrete in its relationship to the day-to-day struggles of the working class, and it also gave the day-to-day struggles of the working class an actual political goal beyond capitalism, namely socialism. So what if Lenin was wrong? What if Lenin was wrong? Well, if Lenin's wrong, then that means that the anarchists are right. It means that the day-to-day struggles of the working class in capitalism, the consciousness of that struggle is already socialist, right? That is, that basically, that socialism just is the demand for the just redistribution of the products of labor. And that capitalism is just the unjust exploitation and ripoff of the workers by rich people and by the state that serves their interests. So that would mean that the anarchists are right. It would also mean that the liberals are right. In other words, liberals also have a critique of the corruption of politics by rich people, right? By narrow, particular, special interests, right? So the liberals would also be right if Lenin is wrong about this, right? In other words, socialism would just be the just distribution of the products of labor to the working class. In other words, that's how we get to equating socialism with the welfare state.
In connection with that, Tio comments that Jamie's question, he's not sure that her question was addressed. How activists today think that welfare gains train people for politics.
Okay, so let me talk about that. Welfare gains train people for politics. Well, of course, we know what that means, don't we? It trains people to vote for the Democrats. In other words, when you give people welfare, then they vote for the people who maintain that welfare, and they vote against people who threaten to take it away. So that just means training people to vote for the Democrats. And that's what Milton Friedman objected to. That's what the neoliberals and the ordo liberals objected to. They objected to the creation, the road to serfdom. They objected to the creation of mass dependency on capitalist politicians. In other words, the clientele, the client relationship of capitalist politicians to the people who they serve welfare to. Right? That basically would make people the slaves of capitalist politicians on whom they're dependent to get welfare goods. That's true, by the way. In other words, that criticism of the welfare state as creating a clientele of poor people dependent on capitalist politicians, that's completely true. That liberal critique of the welfare state is entirely correct. Socialists, of course, agreed with that. Historically, socialists said the welfare state is bad because it makes people dependent on capitalist politicians. It's undemocratic, right? It creates a condition of dependency in which people have to answer to politicians and in which politicians no longer have to answer to the people because the people are dependent on the politicians. The politicians have the power and the people don't. That's true. And of course, anarchists also are against the welfare state for that reason as well. Right? The welfare state just makes people dependent and enslaved to the state. That's true. That's true. So yes, the welfare state trains people politically. It trains them to be voters for the politicians who support the welfare state. That's true. And that's what the DSA is. That's what democratic socialism is. It's capital D democratic socialism. And it's socialism meaning the welfare state. Right? So it's about mobilizing voters to vote for politicians who will give them welfare. And it's basically arguing that the Democrats should adopt this policy because it's a winning strategy for winning elections. And it is a winning strategy for winning elections. That's how the Democratic Party was the ruling party from 1932 until 1994. Right? So the Democratic Party was the majority party in the United States almost uninterruptedly. Eisenhower wasn't really much of a Republican until 1968 because of Nixon, but that only happened because the Democrats had screwed up in Vietnam. But really, the Democrats ruled the United States more or less uninterruptedly from 1932 to 1994, to the Republican Revolution under Newt Gingrich of 1994. And how did they rule the United States? By making the population dependent on them through the welfare state. That's right.
So
that's not socialism, and it doesn't lead to socialism. not at all, because it disempowers the people. Of course it does. The anarchists, the liberals, they're right about that.
Barbara Kay asked early on, can you explain to me what it is exactly that Bernie Sanders believes, as opposed to what he says he believes, in order to make himself palatable to most Americans? If he had the power, in what relation would he stand to Marx and Lenin's vision?
Well, that's complicated. Obviously, I don't know what Bernie Sanders really believes, right? But I have some educated guesses I can make. My educated guesses are this. I think that Bernie Sanders was a new leftist who came to consciousness in the early 1960s under the rule of the Democratic Party's New Deal coalition and their welfare state. And he became a socialist around the time of the Great Society, the expansion of the welfare state under LBJ. He was a supporter of the civil rights movement and an opponent of the Vietnam War. And that's his formative experience, right? And he essentially objected to the ruling Democratic Party of the time as being compromised in such a way that it had to take the United States to war in places like Vietnam, and it had to deny the popular aspirations, for instance, those expressed by the civil rights movement, because of its collusion in the capitalist status quo. And the capitalist status quo could not bear to meet certain popular demands. And so he understood socialism as a kind of opposition to that compromise with capitalist interests that prevent the will of the people from being realized. So that's the 60s. So there's that Bernie Sanders. Then there's the Bernie Sanders who actually gets elected as an independent politician. So he's elected as mayor of Burlington, Vermont. He's elected to Congress. He's now a senator, so he's still a sitting senator. And he has been a capitalist politician elected to office since the early 1980s. And I think that his career as a capitalist politician is one in which he has seen the welfare state that he took for granted in the 60s attacked from the right by the Republicans. And he's seen the Democrats giving in to that assault, compromising with the Republicans and giving up on the welfare state. And he's been an advocate for resistance to that assault from the right. And he's been a critic of the Democrats insofar as they seem to have failed to resist this assault from the right and have compromised themselves with the right over time. So I think one would have to distinguish between the early Bernie Sanders, who thought of himself as a socialist activist, and the later Bernie Sanders, who has operated as a capitalist politician who thinks that the Democrats have not adequately defended themselves against an assault from the right. And his presidential candidacy of 2016 and 2020 are based on trying to restore the Democrats to their pre-neoliberal position. And of course, that's not all that he wants, but that's the least that he wants, right? So that's what he wants. He thinks that that's like a bare minimum. The bare minimum is to return to the old 1960s style Great Society welfare state. And then from there, we could proceed to press things onto socialism. But first, we have to get back to, right, where we were in the 60s. I think that's his honest position. And that whatever sympathies he might have had as a young person or might still have today towards things like the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik Party and Lenin, he would understand that as like the steps necessary to take in a place like Russia to fight for the rights of the people. right? And so this is why he could have a sympathetic attitude towards the Cuban Revolution, towards the Vietnamese against the United States. But he would think that in the United States, you don't have to take the measures that were necessary for Lenin and the Bolsheviks in 1917 in Russia. In other words, that you could fight for the rights of the people and struggle for socialism without having to take such extreme measures of force and violence. Right, so the idea would be that here you would struggle, but conditions here don't require what took place in other countries like China and Cuba and Russia. That would be the idea. And by the way, that was also the idea of progressive liberals in the 1930s. In other words, many progressive liberals in the 1930s were sympathetic to the Soviet Union and sympathetic to communism. And they just thought, well, such extreme measures of violence and state repression won't be necessary to achieve socialism, by which they understood a more equitable and just society in a place like the United States. In the United States, it could happen through the expansion of the welfare state until finally the capitalists themselves are expropriated because their role is rendered superfluous. Right? You could expand the public sector until the private sector is just absorbed by it. Right? So I think that that's generally Bernie Sanders' perspective. But what he was struggling for in his last two presidential campaigns was to get back to what the Democrats had established in the 1960s in the Great Society, building on the New Deal. I would say myself, that the perspective of Marxism is that the welfare state is not a step along the way to socialism, but is a step contrary to socialism. It's moving in the opposite direction from socialism. It's not a midway position towards socialism. It's moving in the exact opposite direction from socialism. And again, that's where the anarchists and the ordo liberals, the classical liberals, the neoliberals, that's where they're right. That's where they're actually correct about that. They just think, of course, that the ordo liberals, the neoliberals, they don't think, they essentially think that the highest form of freedom is a liberal civil society, right? So they don't, they think that, that they object to the dictatorship of the proletariat. They object to a political resolution to the problem of capitalism. The anarchists too. The anarchists also reject the dictatorship of the proletariat. And of course, liberal Democrats, normal welfare state, technocratic welfare state people also, of course, reject the dictatorship of the proletariat. They think of the dictatorship of the proletariat as impossible and also unnecessary and undesirable, because it probably would be harmful, would probably not have the outcome that Marxism thought that it would, that it wouldn't really lead to socialism at all. It would just lead to a repressive state. Right, so Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, he has this more progressive, liberal, social democratic welfare state idea that you progress through the welfare state to socialism.
We've got a raised hand, but before we get to that raised hand, Pam asks in connection with that, can you speak about the DSA's self-identification with Trotskyism, one party, one class idea, and how they square this with supporting the Democrats? Do they just think with the idea that the Great Society welfare state is socialism?
Well, okay, so there are a couple of different questions built into that problem. And I would say that let's talk about, I've talked a lot about the welfare state. Let's talk about the party. So the idea is that the Democratic Party represents the working class, but the Democratic Party also betrays the working class. So the problem with the Democratic Party is that it's a place where both the organized working class and also the broader poor masses have to adjudicate their interests with the capitalist class. In other words, that it's that basically what you have in the Democratic Party is this kind of fatal compromise between the capitalists and the workers, but that the workers are represented, but their interests are represented in the Democratic Party in a way that they're not by the Republican Party. That's the idea. And so the idea is that you want to transform the Democratic Party from being a place of capitalists and workers to just becoming a workers' party, to being a labor party, for example, like the UK Labour Party, that's based on the organized working class in a more direct way than the Democratic Party is. Now, they think that that would mean, right, that it would be a socialist party. In other words, they conflate the distinction between a labor party or a working class based party with a socialist party. But that's their perspective. Their perspective is that what you want to do is move in a direction politically where the Democrats rely more and more on working class support, and that the working class support gains the upper hand in the party and is therefore able to win out in the struggle and compromise with the capitalist class. So that's their idea anyway. I think the Marxist idea is that the UK Labour Party is a capitalist party. It's a capitalist party. It's a party for administering capitalism. That's what it is. It's not a party aimed at the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a party aimed at the working class's political say in the governing of capitalism. So it's about having a seat at the table, right? So it's about the workers participating in democratic government and then being able to press their demands from the standpoint of the state in conjunction with, and also, you know, to the advantage over the capitalists. So again, there is like Fabian socialism. There is this idea that you could turn the capitalists into a kind of rentier clientele of the state. In other words, that you could have the workers rule the state and the capitalists just reduced to shareholders, and then have the role of shareholders in the economy gradually diminished, and that would be the achievement of socialism. It's very plausible, by the way. Like, that's a very plausible perspective. There's no, you know, on the face of it, there's no reason why that can't happen, right? And yet, right, again, what I'm here to represent is why Marxism thought that that wouldn't work. So why Marxism thought that wouldn't work is that Marxism didn't think that capitalism was just the interests of the capitalists. They didn't think that that was the nature of the problem. They didn't think that that's what overcoming capitalism meant. They didn't think that it's about politically defeating the profiteers, the rich people. That's not how they understood the problem of capitalism. And so from a Marxist perspective, it's completely understandable how a workers' government could enforce the dictates of capital over the working class without that meaning being bribed by or answering to the rich people, right? That you could have the complete suppression of rich people, of capitalists per se, and you could still have a workers' government that's dictating the imperatives of capital, right? The economic needs of an industrial capitalist economy. That's a kind of a deep question that takes us far afield, but that's what someone like Lenin assumed. Someone like Lenin assumed that you could have the Labour Party come to power in the UK and it being capitalism, totally capitalism. Like, that is capitalism. That's not socialism. It's not a step towards socialism. It's just capitalism. that you could have a governing party based on the self-organized and even conscious, but again, in its trade union consciousness, the working class. And it would still be capitalism.
We've got a raised hand from Kevin.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So Miliband as a pivotal figure for the New Left represents a transition from Keynesian Fordism to neoliberalism. And so the question is, what were the missed opportunities looking back to clearing thought taboos or psychological resistance concerning Lenin as a theoretician and practitioner in that transitory moment from Keynesian Fordism to neoliberalism? And how is that playing out similarly or differently in our transitory moment from neoliberalism to post-neoliberalism? You know, aside from the collapse of Stalinism as a ruling political power, as with the USSR, were or are there opportunities to liquidate thought taboos or psychological resistance to Lenin that weren't there a few decades ago? Why hasn't it become easier since Miliband's moment? Certainly, you know, the liquidation of Trotskyism and also a few rare liberal academics and otherwise very nutty people plays a role.
Right. Okay. So I would say that this is where the party question comes in. In other words, that we shouldn't equate the state and the party. Now, why does that matter? I would say that the great taboo coming out of the New Left is the taboo on the party. And that taboo can take two forms. It can take the form of the rejection of the party. It can also take the form of a kind of fetishization of the party as some ideal that is somehow elusive and never achieved. So generally speaking, the problem that the New Left rebelled against was that the mass socialist parties of their time were regarded as conservative and as part of the political status quo. So that's true of the SPD, the Social Democratic parties. It's also true of the communist parties in places like France and Italy. Even when they were excluded from government, they were perceived by the New Left as parties complicit with and upon which the status quo actually rested. And that was true, that is accurate. And not only that, but the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were also complicit in the global capitalist order. In other words, there was some competition, there was some friction, but generally speaking, the Soviet Union was for the maintenance of the global status quo. Whereas other communist currents, like for instance, a kind of Che Guevara in the Cuban Revolution, or Mao, especially with the Cultural Revolution, China, the Vietnamese in struggling against the French and against the United States, and you know, I guess you could also say North Korea. That North Korea was not happy to stay north of the 38th parallel, but tried to take the entire the Communist Party of Korea tried to take the entire Korean peninsula in the Korean War. But generally speaking, so there were some exceptions, but generally speaking, the communist parties throughout the world and these states of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were seen as too complacent, too complicit, too accepting of the status quo. Now, the question is why and how. In other words, it was basically political conservatism. It was seen as political conservatism. And so the party symbolized that. The party symbolized a kind of political conservatism. And therefore, the party came to be seen as the problem. So what's keeping the people from becoming revolutionary? What's keeping people from rebelling? The fact that all the revolutionary energy is bottled up in the party, is kind of monopolized by the party. So I would say that you know, is really the taboo that we inherit from that era. Now, in a place like the United States, it's more complicated because, of course, the Communist Party would not have been seen directly as a force of political repression. It would have been seen as somewhat complacent, as maybe a little craven, a little beholden to the Democratic Party, a little too defensive with regard to, not wanting to undermine the position of the progressive liberals too much. But it's not like this massive repressive force of political conservatism the way it is in a place like France. And obviously, its complicity in the global status quo is by virtue of its adherence to the Moscow line, right, of official communism. But generally speaking, even though it's a little different in the United States than it is in a place like France, where we get a lot of like new leftism from, in terms of theoretical, intellectual, cultural perspectives. But even so, right, in the United States, it's kind of like, well, what is the party? The party seems to enforce a kind of discipline, both in theory and in practice, that ultimately compromises with the status quo and is therefore repressive and conservative. So that disenchantment with the party, has proved to be something that contributes to neoliberalism, because neoliberalism also expressed a broader kind of disenchantment with political parties. So generally speaking, neoliberalism was unhappy with the bureaucratic administrative character of the mass capitalist parties, like the Democratic Party in the United States. So the Democratic Party in the United States is now much less thoroughly organized, but also the Republican Party is also less thoroughly organized as a social as well as a political force than these parties were in the 1960s. So generally speaking, there's been a disillusionment and disenchantment with politics, at least understood as party politics. Being a party member, being part of a political organization, a party. Right, that's become a more of a niche kind of minority, kind of specialized function, rather than the more broader popular phenomenon that it was in the mid-20th century. So I think that, again, that's what Lenin stands for. So obviously Lenin can be associated with Stalinism, can be associated with the state, but generally speaking, Lenin is more closely associated with the party. And the party today doesn't exist. In other words, not even the capitalist parties of the 1960s exist in the same way today. The neoliberalism has expressed a disenchantment with party politics in general. Party discipline of any kind, party organization of any kind. And so this is a real difficulty on the left, because on the left, any kind of organizational discipline is immediately seen as Stalinist. It's immediately seen as Leninist or Trotskyist in the pejorative sense, in the sense of repressive, in the sense of diminishing possibilities rather than enhancing, increasing possibilities for taking action. And again, the DSA kind of squares the circle with that by basically saying, well, we have to engage in party politics, but we have to transform the Democratic Party into a form of party politics that serves the workers as opposed to the capitalists. So again, they kind of put that aside, but in practice, the DSA, really, they have all the internal controversies that one saw in the New Left. So you have ideological struggle, you have a constant struggle over coalition building, and that's usually understood in terms of PC identity politics. So you have people attacking each other for being racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic. white supremacist, right? Like that's what the controversies in the DSA are about, right? They're about class versus race, gender, and sexuality and gender identity. You know, should we have a class first perspective or not? You know, and so you basically have replicated on the left, more broadly, you have replicated the kind of struggles that take place in the Democratic Party electoral coalition. So the Democratic Party is an electoral coalition of different ethno-cultural constituencies who you know, come together and press their demands and then come to some kind of mutually agreed upon compromise among the different demands. And the left is the sort of miniature version of that, of the Democratic Party. And again, in the neoliberal environment, this is not really understood as a function of the party. It's rather understood as communities, community organizing, communities. And so if you're a member of any kind of constituency, you're part of a community. You're in the trans community or the gay community, or you're in the Black community or the Latino community or what have you. You're in some community, right? That's the neoliberal rhetoric that we have. And again, so it tends to be kind of naturalized that this is more like the way society is divided. And so that's the way politics are divided. And it's also the way politics are conducted, that they're conducted as coalitions of community groups, community interest groups. And women are understood as like a community, which is a little strange, but you know, it's feminism. So feminism is a way of, and it's understood that many women are not feminists, but the degree to which women are a community, they're feminist. It's that kind of idea. So I would say that the real legacy of the New Left and of neoliberalism is this taboo around political parties. And there are various aspects to that, but I would say that that's what Lenin really raises for people, I think. They think, okay, what does it mean to adopt revolutionary discipline? And then you have different interpretations of Lenin that come into play. And that's why Maoists can also be kind of neoliberal community organizers and think of themselves as following Lenin. Because they'll say, well, Lenin was not a class only or class first person. He also recognizes other forms of oppression, especially national oppression. And he understood the party as not being a trade union secretary, but the tribune of the people, right? And so they will invoke Lenin for essentially a kind of neoliberal Democratic Party community organizing politics rationale.
So we've got two slightly connected questions from C. Slider. Do you believe there's a way humans could be moved to steal food by hunger and then go steal that food in a calm, unified, mutually beneficial way? What would it take to make humans able to do so? And then in terms of getting there, I have a question from Orestes. Given that we say that there is no revolutionary politics or revolutionary party today, and that, rightly so, welfare state is an obstacle to the fight for socialism and expresses counter-revolutionary politics, what do workers that are under great economical pressure make of it?
Okay, so people stealing food. It's not really a matter of people stealing food. It's about people growing food, right? In other words, it's not about how do you get people to take what they need. It's a matter of how do we produce what we need, right? So someone has to grow the food before anybody can steal it. And so the real question is, how are you going to grow the food? Who's going to grow it? How are social resources going to be allocated in such a way as to produce what humans need to survive? That's the question. It's not about stealing it, because, you know, if nobody's growing it, like in a few months, there won't be any food to steal, right? So it's not about organizing people to steal the food. It's about organizing the people to grow the food. That's what we're really talking about. And capitalism is a way of organizing people to grow the food. And capitalism, by the way, is the most successful way that humans have ever been organized to produce things that humans need. In other words, capitalism is able to support 8 billion people in a way that no other social system has been able to do. And support 8 billion people at a much higher standard of living than any other social system in history has been able to do. It produces the food, it produces the goods, and at a higher level than any society that came before. Right? Hunter-gatherers, right, fed the people, but hunting and gathering could not support 8 billion humans. So capitalism grows the food and distributes the food. It makes and provides what people need in a way that no other social system has ever been able to do. It supports more humans and better than any other social system ever. So that's the first thing that we have to acknowledge, right? We want something better than capitalism. We don't want something worse than capitalism. And actually, there's no evidence that anything better than capitalism is possible. There's no evidence that anything better than capitalism is possible. We got to deal with that. So we're not gonna struggle for socialism based on proof that we can do better than capitalism. That's not how it's going to happen. We're going to struggle for socialism on the basis of what capitalism itself promises, not only ideally, but practically, what feels possible under capitalism, but is somehow eluding us in capitalism. That's the first thing. Now, in terms of the welfare state, I want to qualify what I said. So I said socialists were against the welfare state. Well, yes and no, right? So of course, socialists never rejected welfare provisions, right? But they also didn't actively struggle for the welfare state. In other words, they didn't like attack the welfare state, but they also didn't demand the welfare state. In other words, they accepted the welfare state. If the capitalists want to give us this stuff, that's fine. But it wasn't their positive program. So that's what I meant when I said that socialists rejected the welfare state. They didn't actively reject it, but they also didn't demand it. They accepted it, but they didn't demand it. Now, of course, they agitated against its withdrawal. In other words, once the capitalists provided the welfare state, then when the capitalists tried to take it away, of course, the socialists opposed that. They opposed taking away the welfare state, right? But it wasn't their positive program. It wasn't the positive program of socialism. And in the Reichstag, so the SPD was in the Reichstag, they voted no. The budget, they voted no. They voted no to everything. Because it was, of course, impossible to only vote for the welfare state and not for everything that came with it. Right, so it wasn't their positive program, it wasn't what they demanded, but they accepted it. And they also opposed withdrawing it. But this is the trap that the left has gotten itself into. In other words, on the basis of that history, the left found itself in a defensive position in the neoliberal era. So in other words, they turn the welfare state into something that one accepts, into something that one demands. And that one demands instead of demanding socialism. Right, that's the problem. And so again, we've gotten kind of turned around on this as a function of the last 100 years of history. We've gotten turned around on it. And so we have to be careful. in terms of how we conceive of it. Again, what would it mean to struggle for socialism in a way that is not about demanding the welfare state?
Well, a question about that we've got from Dylan Duran. In reference to all the discussion on the self-activity of the working class, the overcoming of capitalism, and the role of the party, doesn't the ground you've established seem to point to the necessity of a programmatic approach based in the abolition of the value form, with the dictatorship of the proletariat's explicit role not merely being conceived as political revolution, the sovereign exception in the hands of the proletariat, but as with the conscious role of the transformation of capitalist relations of production into, however this is to be conceived, lower stage communist relations of production?
And I would say that that is the old Marxist program. That's exactly what the old Marxist program was. Right. In other words, they demanded the abolition of the wage system. In other words, they had popular phraseology for this, that then the meaning has now become obscure. It's become obscure what that meant, but, they knew what it meant. They knew what it meant. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's the abolition of the value system. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. In other words, pursuing that in the face of the self-destruction of value in capitalism means overcoming value. In other words, obviously, bourgeois value is actually meant to provide from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. The degree to which it's unable to do that, it points beyond the value system, capitalism. So that was the conscious program of Marxism. That was what it was. That's what it was for Marx and Engels. That's what it was for Lenin. Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, Kautsky, that's what their program was. Now, again, they understood something broader than mere political revolution, meaning they talked about social and political action. They also talked about social and political revolution. Social and political revolution. Now, again, how that's been reduced, narrowed, is overthrowing the capitalists, right? So that's what social revolution has come to mean. But in the time when someone like Lenin was learning Marxism, he understood that a social revolution meant transforming society, transforming the social relations. It didn't just mean replacing one social group by another social group, right? And this is what they meant. And of course, they had this rhetoric, and now the rhetoric's very opaque. But this is what they meant by that: the coming to power of the working class would be the end of class society. In other words, that the proletarianized working class coming to power would not be a new ruling class, but it would be the end of class society, right? That meant that they understood class in a very specific way. They didn't understand it as a competition between groups, right? So that's what social revolution meant. So the fact that they said, we want a political revolution, but we don't want to stop at a political revolution. We want a political revolution in order to achieve a social revolution, to open the door to a social revolution. And by social revolution, it wasn't just about replacing one group with another group. So, I think it's pretty clear that they knew exactly what they meant by that. They were good Marxists. They studied, they read Das Kapital, and they understood what the point of it was. They understood, because it wasn't just Marx. It's not like Marx. Marx is a genius, but not only Marx saw this, right? Again, Marx said that his only original contribution is his discovery of the necessity of the dictatorship dictatorship of the proletariat. The necessity of a transitional state. And again, this is the controversial point. This is the controversial point, but it's really the only point. There's a much broader socialist history than Marxism. What distinguishes Marxism from the rest of socialism, a lot of what Marx and Engels wrote, they borrowed from other socialists. They appropriated from other socialists, including from each according to his ability to each according to his need. They didn't invent that. So what is their one original contribution? It's the discovery of the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, of the necessity of a transitional state. And that's what everybody rejects, including most Marxists. They fudge that issue. They avoid that issue. For us, the question is, they may have been right or wrong about that. Marxism might have been right or wrong about that, but to be able to evaluate in what way they were right or wrong, we first have to understand what they meant. Right? The dictatorship of the proletariat was not a militant welfare state. That's not the point. Right? So, I think that that's the challenge. The challenge is, how did these people understand the problem of capitalism? And how did they understand what overcoming it would mean? And how did they understand how to get there from here? In other words, what do you have to do to achieve it? Politically. Otherwise, we're waiting for people to change their culture, to change their social ethic, to change their psychology. And that will never happen. Capitalism makes people miserable. It makes them struggle to survive. It pits them against each other in a struggle for survival. It makes people mean and antisocial out of necessity. Right? Socialism is not going to come out of the goodness of our hearts. It's not. It's going to come out of a recognition of the impasse that capitalist society finds itself in perpetually, again and again, recurrently and continuously. And again, this is something that socialists beyond Marx had already recognized in substance 150 years ago. So we're here talking on Lenin's 150th birthday. What was the world that Lenin was born into? What is the world of 1870? In 1870, a lot of people, in a very self-conscious and already organized way, understand the problem of capitalism much more clearly than people do today.
We've got a hand from Richard, but before we go to that, I just wanted to let everybody know that there's a lot of options you've got for learning more about the history of Marxism and talking about and continuing this conversation. If you look in your chat, there's a link to a Discord where you can see all of the activities going on, as well as an email. We can hook you up with a reading group or a coffee break. And of course, the website has all of the options listed there as well. So with that,
why don't we take this as our last question?
Yeah, I was gonna say this is gonna be our last question here from Richard.
Okay, I actually had a kind of comment, several questions, but let me get to the basic question. You brought up the question of the prosperity of capitalism that produces them better than any socialism. But of course, traditionally, Marxists wouldn't have said that's capitalism. They would have said that the wealth that capitalism produces is a result of industrial society, modern technology, which is itself a product of capitalism. In other words, and the assumption of Marxism and socialism was that that society, right, that industrial society based on modern technology, right, could be severed from capitalism. And so one of the confusions I think that exists nowadays is between those two aspects of modernity, namely capitalism and the question of industrial society modernity, right? And in fact, that would seem to be a large part of sort of the radical ecology movement, etc., right? That when you attack, that capitalism has to be overcome because it destroys the environment, and capitalism is merged with industrial society as a problem. And I guess maybe I'll let you answer that question, because it seems to me there's a problem of imagination there.
There is. So I would say that it was always understood from Marx and Engels onward, including by people like Lenin, that industrial production as it exists in capitalism is not actually the real potential of science and technology and of society. In other words, that it's only a kind of constrained and distorted expression of a real potential that otherwise is not fully expressed, that we haven't seen.
But it was a lot
yet.
better than pre-industrial society in terms of its potential, because it could be developed. In other words,
yes, it was. So in that way, it's, factory production, scientific technique. Again, we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it outside of capitalism. It's never existed outside of capitalism. It really has not. And so therefore we only see a partial image of that potential. And I'm just reminded of Heidegger. In other words, Heidegger said that Auschwitz is the same as industrial farming. In other words, industrial farming, you can use technique to feed a lot of people, or you can use the technique to kill a lot of people. It's just the same thing. In other words, the power is the same. And so, of course, if you have one, then you can always have the other, right? And so I would say that, again, the crisis of imagination that we have is in part because the potential that we see is distorted. It's constrained and distorted. We don't, and again, that's why people will say, well, Marx was always aware of how capitalism destroyed the environment, right? And Engels is aware of how capitalism destroys the environment. So it's not like we've ever seen an emancipatory, a better form of the application of science and technology than what capitalism can provide. We haven't seen that. And it's a hypothetical. And so it's not really about the potential for science and technology, it's about the potential for society. In other words, if technology can be used to feed people or to kill people, then the question is, well, how do we move society towards one in which feeding people is prioritized over killing people? Well, I would say we already live in that society. Let's get real for a second, right? We already live in a society in which feeding people is prioritized over killing people. Let's get real. And so, again, this society already considers war and violence to be bad, right? To be something that we don't really want and that we shouldn't want, right? We already live in that society. So that's not, again, that's not really.
Except that there are wars and people go hungry.
There are, that's right. But everyone considers it to be bad and a problem. Whereas in ancient times, murdering people and starving people was considered good. It was considered good. Let's not kid ourselves about that. War was considered good. And if you could kill people by starving them, that's good too, right? That's not our society. So again, it's the contradiction between bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. The contradiction, and they can't be separated. It's not about separating them, it's about the contradiction. And the question is, what kind of a society can we have? We have a society of, so Hannah Arendt says, labor is, the rights of labor are the way that people, can get along without killing each other, right? That you can choose to exchange with people as opposed to fighting to the death with people. And that's true, right? In other words, if you want people to essentially get along, then you implement the social rights of labor, right? You say, I want to be free to labor, and I'm going to leave you to be free to labor. Capitalism, right, is, again, a crisis of production in which people are no longer required to labor, and in which people are pitted against each other on the basis of the social rights of labor. So rather than everyone getting along and producing and exchanging, right, that's what the society is supposed to be. It's a society in which there's a zero-sum game, a kind of competition, in which people are driven against each other. And again, that's the real contradiction. And the question is, what role does technology have in that? Right? In other words, the technology has not played the role of making people produce more. It's created a situation in which people are driven against each other out of desperation due to not being able to find a job, not being able to be a producer, a free producer in society. That's really what, the problem of capitalism is. So I would say that, it's not that Marxists said that, capitalism has produced or had not produced. They understood their society as capitalist society. They understood that we don't want to go back, right? We don't want to go back to pre-capitalism. And the reason we don't want to go back to pre-capitalism is not only because we'd have to give up technology, but also because we'd give up a whole host of social rights and freedoms. In other words, that's the real reason we don't want to go back. I mean, what I always like to say is, if we were to go back to some subsistence economy, right, subsistence agriculture, so some bare subsistence economy, then we have to bring everything back with it. We have to bring back caste, and we have to bring back slavery and everything else. You can't go back to a subsistence economy without what the subsistence economy had.
But what I was pointing out was the opposite, that the question of Marxism was the optimism of Marxism was based on the idea that modernity involves separable components.
Did they think they were separable? Marxism
well, if you believe that you can have a socialist revolution, right, and keep modernity of production, even extend modernity of production, right, that you can change relationships of ownership of the means of production, social rule, class rule, many things, right, that you can transform society and yet keep certain aspects of the material, technical, etc. infrastructure of modernity. In other words, it's that sense of the separability of parts of modernity that was a basis for the optimism of Marxism. What I was just pointing out is, it seems to me that to a large extent, the pessimism of the present is based on the opposite feeling that those things are not separable, right? That in fact, if, for example, and this goes back to the question, for example, that the welfare state and democracy, right? That classical Marxism assumed that you could separate the problem of democracy from the question of the ownership of means of production, market, etc. In other words, certain aspects of capital society that were good could be kept and even extended, while others could be abolished or
so
transformed.
I'll use a phrase from Lenin just to help wrap this up, which is, Lenin said socialism equals Soviet power plus electrification.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of.
Right, so socialism is Soviet power plus electrification, but it's not one without the other, right? It's both. It's Soviet power plus electrification. And so again, it's mostly like people, I think, starting with the New Left, I think people started hearing that as technologism. In other words, they heard Lenin saying socialism equals electrification, because they didn't know what Soviet power plus electrification means.
So you're distinguishing that with, say, the Tennessee Valley Authority,
right?
Which is capitalism, progressivism plus electrification.
Right. That's right.
Right. So, but then the question is, how do you justify to people, right, the basis, the original optimism, right? I think that that's the central question that one keeps returning to. How do you persuade people that the original optimism of Marxism was justified?
Okay, so then I'll say this, that we face a problem that someone like Lenin would find incomprehensible or nonsensical, meaning when you ask the question, how do we convince people? The question is, who do you mean, right? Like, who do we have to convince? So for Lenin, he didn't think that he had to convince the working class to struggle for socialism. So that's like, we get the earlier question that we had about socialist consciousness coming from outside, right? That gets misconstrued as you need socialists to convince the workers to struggle for socialism. Lenin didn't think that. Like, in other words, he didn't think you had to convince the workers to struggle for socialism. He didn't think that at all. You might have to convince the intelligentsia. You might have to convince petty bourgeois intellectuals that socialism is a good idea. But that's secondary, right? In other words, their optimism was based on the idea that actually the workers didn't need to be convinced because it was in their objective interests. In other words, that they could see that in a very kind of step-by-step methodical way, that actually workers would see the need for socialism and the desirability for socialism.
And there was a lot of empirical evidence for that then. But now,
and you could say now too, right? You could say now too, right? You could say that they had a certain way of thinking about the relationship between the subjective and the objective that now seem to be completely separated. In other words, now it's you know, at least from a Marxist perspective, it's objectively necessary and possible to achieve socialism as in Lenin's time. So the only thing that changed was the subjective factor. And again, the subjective factor is deep because it has to do with the way people think of politics. You know, in other words, that the workers of Lenin's time, for instance, you know, they would have seen their democratic interests served by a socialist party, right? There wouldn't be this accumulated historical experience of betrayal, right? And right. So, and I think that now I'm not sure that it's really like the working class per se that's affected by the subjective problem. I think it's more a problem of left-wing intellectuals, petty bourgeois intellectuals, that it's a specific kind of subjective problem that's really an obstacle now. And again, it's like Lenin would have taken for granted that, of course, he can't tell the workers what to do. In other words, he would have just taken for granted as a sociological proposition that some petty bourgeois intellectuals like him are never going to be in a position to dictate to the workers what they should want or how they should get it. Whereas now I think that petty bourgeois intellectuals stop themselves and they say, who am I to tell the workers what they should want? Who am I to impose my will on the working class? Whereas that kind of a problem would never have even occurred to Lenin, right? He wouldn't have thought that it was within his power to either cajole or convince or impose his will or his theoretical perspective on the working class. He would have just thought that's just a kind of impossibility. Whereas now, of course, intellectuals stop themselves and they say, well, who am I to, you know, impose, right? And it's not just Lenin. I think that Marx and Engels also would have thought that it would have been a ridiculous notion that they would have, you know, been imposing their will on the working class. You know? And so I think that that's really the impasse that we find ourselves in on the socialist left, is that it's really a kind of self-imposed, it's taboo, what we were mentioning before. It's a taboo among left-wing intellectuals, you know, that we confront. And again, Lenin would have been freed of that taboo, but not because he was some unconscious dictator. right? You know, he was not assuming that, of course,
Presumably, Kautsky was free of that taboo too.
absolutely, of course, right, exactly. Like, and again, you know, now we have this kind of hothouse environment among supposed leftist intellectuals, but really they just, you know, they bring themselves into a froth over something that's really not about socialism or Marxism. That's really about being technocratic functionaries in the welfare state. That's what it's really about. It's not about socialism at all. So Marxism and this sort of historical imagery of Marxism just serves a kind of pantomime for what is just the angst of technocratic, bureaucratic functionaries of the welfare state. All right, if you want to join the welfare state, if you want to be a technocratic functionary, you're a Democrat. If you don't, you're a Republican. Right, in terms of students, right? In terms of students, right? Students on campus, the people who aspire to be like philanthropic, right? Join the Democrats, and people who feel like you should respect people's freedom and leave them alone and not try to be technocratic bureaucrats are the students who become Republicans.
And by contrast, we want to have the courage to think again. So,
indeed, indeed. Those are not the only two alternatives. Those are not the only two alternatives. The two alternatives are not statism and anarchy, right? It's not libertarianism or welfare statism. Those are not the two alternatives. That's not it. Those are the alternatives in capitalist politics, kind of, in this ideologically distorted and really dishonest, actually. That division is dishonest. But that's not the only, those aren't the only choices. And history can show us that maybe there are other possibilities.
Chris, I believe I speak on behalf of our audience in thanking you for the presentation and fielding a solid 2 hours of questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I just reminded everybody, you can hop on that Discord server where we'll be posting all sorts of conversations happening around the world. So yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. And we look forward to the next one.
And happy birthday, Lenin.
Happy birthday.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Chris.
Bye.